friend and colleague of mine. And at one point I asked her, what would you most want to hear someone say to you after you performed? She told me the story of a recital that she gave, and afterwards an old man coming up to her and saying nothing but thank you. And she sort of blushed and chuckled, and she asked for what? And he said, for sharing your story. Music at its very core is a narrative art form. And many of the world's greatest musicians, from Bach and Mozart to Bob Dylan and Kendrick Lamar, and Britney Spears, they're also some of the world's greatest storytellers. And I've been fortunate enough to grow up with all of them. You know, I remember sitting in the back seat of the car while my dad would drive me to school in the morning, and we'd be listening to classic rock on the radio. And now when I go to the library and sit down to diligently do my homework, I'm searching music blogs, and I'm looking for the next big hip-hop artist. But the truth is, nothing can tell me a story quite like classical music can. You know, I can really be engaged in a piece of classical music when I can let my imagination soar. It's a powerful experience. I think of it sort of like reading a book, because there's this idea of creativity that comes from two separate platforms. You know, first, we have an author, or in this case a composer, who creates this narrative and then expertly crafts it on paper and fine-tunes it until it's just right. And then we, as a listener or as a reader, we get to have our own unique creative experience. We let it speak to us individually. And this creative collaboration happens in such subtle and nuanced ways when we listen to classical music. It's transcendent, really. And everyone deserves to have that sort of experience. Yet, so many of my generation has such a hard time connecting. And while, of course, there's a stylistic gap between classical music and the pop music of today, the music of Bach and Mozart and of Bob Dylan and of Kendrick Lamar, they're all telling the same sorts of stories. So, why does this dissonance in our propensity to hear a musical narrative exist today? Is it because of classical music itself? Is it something about the type of life that we all come to live? Why are there these barriers to entry, and how can we tackle them to make classical music more accessible? Now, I've talked to my friends some about this, and a common thread is that when you listen to classical music, it's really hard to hear a narrative after just one listen, especially if the environment isn't conducive to deep concentration and creative freedom. And without the power of your imagination, all music gets boring. Like, really boring. So let's do an experiment. I want to show you something. That was the beginning of the Red Violin Caprices by John Corigliano. And it makes me think of a wide open field. It's a bright sunny day, and there's just this shimmering golden light for as far as the eye can see. And in the middle of the field, there's a woman standing there and singing this tune. But that's just me. You know, what's so beautiful about this is that you can hear it in so many different ways, take it in so many different directions. Imagine it's a gloomy, rainy day, and you hear this piece being played at a funeral. Or what if this told a more definite story? What if this piece had a more concrete narrative? Imagine a blind man being given the miracle of sight. And he walks outside for the first time, he opens his doors. And as he sees grass and trees and mountains for the first time, he's suddenly content. Did you feel something? Maybe you did, and maybe you didn't. And you know what? That's okay too. Not every piece speaks to us. Not when we listen to pop music, not when we read books. It's the nature of all art. But for so many of us, this lack of emotional response happens far too frequently, specifically when we listen to classical music. And I want to find a way to change that. So maybe it's something about the environment. What if, when you listen to classical music, you always felt comfortable and relaxed? You know, so often we treat classical music as purely a historical relic, and that takes away from a lot of its narrative potential. And the whole concept of a concert hall in today's day and age, frankly, it's antiquated. It's not how we experience any other type of music anymore. So for classical music to speak to us, we should want to be in a setting that grants us comfort. And that's not in a big concert hall where there's a dress code and there are rules about when to sit and when to clap and when to cough. Imagine a much more intimate, more informal venue. Say a black box theater. Did you know that that type of venue was what many classical composers had in mind when they imagined when they wrote these pieces? They wrote for churches and ballrooms and parlors more than they wrote for concert halls. And concert halls then, and certainly the expectations of an audience member, they're vastly different than they are today. So let's craft a little bit of this imaginary perfect performance venue. What if there was an area to sit, but also an area to stand and to walk around? And what if taking pictures and making noise, it wasn't just tolerated, but encouraged? And what if the venue was intimate enough that you always felt a personal connection to the performers? Now, by the way, this absolutely works from the other side, too. As a performer, I strive for opportunities where I can individually engage with audience members. And a stage is just so limiting for exactly that purpose. So it seems clear to me that the setting is a factor, a barrier to entry. What about the fact that you watched me play just now? You know, we live in an age where we're absolutely flooded with visual stimulation. It's on our phones, it's on our tablets, it's on our computers, it's on our TVs. And the music video has become an essential component in the way that we listen to and experience pop music. It's a second medium that allows the musicians and a director to combine an audio narrative with a visual narrative. And what if we brought that idea to classical music? Would it put a bind on our musical, creative narrative power? Or would it help erase a stigma that classical music is boring? Now, in my experience, the easiest way to be able to have this sensation when you listen to classical music is just to immerse yourself. You know, when we begin to read books, it takes time before all of the different characters and all the different subplots become organized in our heads. But with a little bit of patience, we teach ourselves to do it. So open Spotify and start anywhere. Start with Bach and Mozart. They're familiar names with familiar pieces. Or start with Copland and Gershwin, some of the music that brought us to Broadway. Or start with Mahler and his bombastic symphonies. No matter where we start, what's important is that we continue to work to break down these barriers that surround classical music today, to help unleash its creative power on a wider, younger audience. It's a book that a lot of us are missing out on. Thank you.